Cleopatra was born into a world of gold and blood, a kingdom where power was a fragile illusion, and betrayal lurked behind every silk curtain. From the moment she opened her eyes, she was surrounded not by lullabies, but by whispers. Whispers of conquest, of politics, of a dynasty that devoured itself from within. She was not supposed to be ordinary. No child of the Ptolemies ever was. But even among them, Cleopatra was different. She was taught to listen before she spoke, to observe before she acted. While other royal children played among marble halls, Cleopatra wandered through the libraries of Alexandria, memorizing languages with an ease that unnerved her tutors. She learned the tongue of diplomats, of warriors, of merchants, even the ancient language of the Egyptians themselves, a language her own family had ignored for centuries. But Cleopatra embraced it, not as a novelty, but as a promise. One day, she believed, Egypt would need a ruler who truly understood its people. But childhood in the palace was not gentle. Every smile hid an agenda, every servant carried secrets, and every sibling was a potential enemy. Cleopatra saw alliances shift like desert sand. Brothers turned against brothers, sisters poisoned sisters, and all of them clawed for the same thing, the throne. She learned early that love was rare in her world, and trust was a dangerous luxury. Still, she believed in destiny. She believed that the gods shaped certain souls for greatness, and she felt, deep in her chest, that hers was one of them. When her father, Ptolemy XV, returned from exile, shaken and humiliated, Cleopatra watched him grasp desperately at Roman support. She saw how Egypt's pride was slowly traded for security. It was in those years that she began to understand the true shape of power, not the kind worn like a crown, but the kind negotiated in shadows, in alliances, in debts. Her father was a king, but he behaved like a servant. Cleopatra swore she would never kneel as he did. As she grew older, she studied politics with the same hunger she had once devoted to languages. She learned how to read people, how to dissect their ambitions, their fears, their desires. And she learned something else. Words were sharper than swords. One well-placed phrase could win a war. One expression could cripple an enemy. Cleopatra mastered this art before she was even 16. Then came the moment she had feared all her life. Her father died, and the burden of the kingdom fell upon her shoulders. Not alone, but beside her younger brother Ptolemy III, a boy too easily manipulated, too easily controlled. Their co-rule was a lie from the start. Courtiers gathered around him like vultures, whispering poison into his ears. They told him Egypt was his by birthright, that his sister was too ambitious, too clever, too dangerous. Cleopatra had expected conflict, but she had not expected exile. Under the cover of night, she was forced to flee Alexandria, stripped of her titles, her guards, her home. The Queen of Egypt suddenly found herself wandering the dusty borders of her own kingdom, surrounded by a handful of loyal followers and a growing sense of betrayal. But Cleopatra did not break. Exile only hardened her resolve. She understood something that her brother's advisors did not. Egypt was drowning in Roman influence. Whoever controlled Rome controlled the Nile. And if she wanted her throne back, she needed an ally far more powerful than any Alexandrian courtier. She needed someone whose name could shift the balance of the world with a single decision. She needed Julius Caesar. But Caesar was not easily impressed. He was the most feared man in Rome, a general whose victories had reshaped continents, a leader whose ambition mirrored her own. Approaching him recklessly could mean death. Approaching him timidly would mean failure. So she chose a third option. She would arrive before him as no queen ever had. And one night, as the torches of Alexandria flickered against the palace walls, Cleopatra prepared the boldest entrance of her life, an entrance that would not only alter her fate, but rewrite the destiny of empires. She would not return to Egypt as an exile. She would return as a storm. Cleopatra entered Alexandria not as a fugitive, but as a phantom, hidden within a rolled carpet, or perhaps a linen sack, depending on the storyteller. She was smuggled through corridors thick with political tension. Servants hurried past, unaware that the woman inside the bundle carried the fate of a kingdom with her. When the wrappings finally fell open at Julius Caesar's feet, Cleopatra rose like a figure conjured from myth, calm, composed, and fiercely unbroken. Caesar was not a man easily moved. He had stared down armies, crossed forbidden rivers, and gambled with the Republic itself. But in that moment, When Cleopatra stood before him with dust on her feet and fire in her eyes, something shifted. She spoke with confidence, not pleading for her throne, but asserting what she believed was already hers. She did not ask Caesar for salvation. She offered him partnership. She told him of Egypt's potential, of its wealth, its grain, its unmatched strategic value. She spoke of alliances, of futures shaped by cooperation rather than fear. And Caesar, ever calculating, saw the brilliance in her. She was not merely a pawn in an Egyptian feud. She was a queen shaped by struggle, sharpened by exile, and more intelligent than any advisor in the palace. Their alliance was forged that night, not in candlelit seduction, as gossip would one day claim, but in mutual recognition. They saw themselves in each other, ambitious, visionary, willing to defy tradition for the sake of destiny. But their union sparked fury among her enemies. Ptolemy III's advisors accused Cleopatra of manipulating Caesar, of poisoning him with foreign charm. Riots erupted in the streets. The people of Alexandria, torn between loyalty and suspicion, filled the city with chaos. Caesar was no longer a guest, he was a target. War loomed like a dark cloud over the palace, and then the palace caught fire. Flames devoured scrolls of the great library, turning centuries of knowledge into smoke that spiraled into the night sky. As the city burned, Caesar and Cleopatra made plans, precise, calculated, ruthless plans. Caesar's legions fought with Roman discipline, while Cleopatra's supporters joined the battle with renewed passion. The conflict culminated at the Nile, where Ptolemy III's forces were crushed, and the young king himself drowned while attempting to flee. When the sun rose, Egypt had only one ruler, Cleopatra. She returned to the palace not as a guest of Rome, but as a sovereign whose power had been reclaimed through intellect and audacity. Yet the world whispered. They said she had seduced Caesar, that she was a temptress, a manipulator, a woman who used beauty to disguise ambition. But Cleopatra knew the truth. She had won because she understood the game better than any of her rivals. She did not steal power. She seized it, shaped it, commanded it. When Caesar announced he would remain in Egypt for a time, the whispers grew louder. And when Cleopatra bore him a son, Caesarion, Rome erupted in scandal. A foreign queen carrying the heir of Julius Caesar? It was unthinkable, dangerous, a threat to the very balance of the Republic. But in Alexandria, Cleopatra ruled with renewed confidence. She envisioned a future where her son would unite two great civilizations, where Egypt would rise again as a center of knowledge, culture, and innovation. With Caesar beside her, that dream felt within reach. Together, they sailed down the Nile in a grand procession that dazzled even seasoned soldiers. Cleopatra showed Caesar temples older than the myths he had grown up with, tombs of ancient pharaohs, monuments carved before Rome had even been imagined. And Caesar, who had conquered half the known world, looked upon Egypt with newfound awe. For a brief moment, Cleopatra felt victorious, not just politically, but personally. She had restored her legacy. She had secured her son's future. She had tamed one of the most powerful men on earth. But destiny is never gentle with those who dream too boldly. Caesar was summoned back to Rome. His triumph awaited, his reforms, his battles, his enemies. Cleopatra watched his ship disappear beyond the horizon, knowing the world was shifting once again. She told herself their alliance would endure, that Rome would accept her eventually. Yet in the shadows of the Senate, knives were already being sharpened. And the next time Cleopatra heard Caesar's name, it would be carried by a messenger whose face was pale with fear. The message reached Cleopatra like a shifting wind, one of those silent breezes that carries disaster long before the storm becomes visible. Julius Caesar had been murdered, stabbed in the Senate by men he believed were allies, betrayed not on the battlefield, but in the heart of the Republic he had reshaped. Cleopatra listened without blinking, but inside her chest, something cracked. She had known that Rome was dangerous. She had known that ambition carried a price, but she had not expected the world to change so suddenly, so brutally. For the first time in years, she felt truly alone. Caesar had been more than an ally. He had been her protector, her partner in vision, the father of her child. With his death, everything she had built trembled. In Egypt, she could pretend she was still untouchable. But in Rome, power shifted like a snake shedding its skin. And Cleopatra knew she was now vulnerable, yet she did not collapse into grief. She ordered the palace guarded, reinforced the loyalty of her generals, and prepared for the chaos that would inevitably follow. She understood the Roman mind. They might fear her, despise her, or desire her, but they would never ignore her. Rome fractured into war. On one side stood Marc Antony, Caesar's brilliant and unpredictable general. On the other stood Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, cold and calculating even in youth. Cleopatra watched from afar, measuring each man's ambition, each man's hunger. And when the dust briefly settled, when Antony emerged as one of the rulers of Rome's divided empire, Cleopatra made a choice. She would meet him. Before he could summon her, she would go to him, on her terms. Her entrance into Tarsus became legend. Cleopatra refused to arrive as a queen seeking approval. She arrived as a goddess, draped in gold, sailing on a barge scented with incense, surrounded by musicians playing melodies that drifted across the river like smoke. Servants fanned her with peacock feathers as the sun lit her silhouette like a flame. Antony, a man accustomed to dominance, found himself disarmed. Cleopatra did not bow. She charmed, she intrigued, she controlled the stage as if the gods themselves had choreographed the moment. Antony was captivated, but Cleopatra was not naive. She knew his reputation: brave, bold, impulsive, but vulnerable to flattery and indulgence. She also knew that Rome needed Egypt's wealth, and Egypt needed Rome's protection. Their alliance, once formed, became both political and personal. But unlike Caesar, Antony was more chaos than calculation, more fire than steel. Their nights in Alexandria became infamous. Festivals, games, drinking contests, philosophical debates that lasted until dawn. The world gossiped endlessly about their excess. But Cleopatra understood the truth. Antony found in her something he had lost in Rome: freedom. She found in him something she desperately needed: loyalty. Yet the shadow of Octavian loomed. He despised Cleopatra. He despised her influence, her intelligence, her presence in Rome's affairs. She threatened his narrative, one where Rome belonged to him alone, one where Caesar's legacy flowed exclusively through his veins. And so Octavian began to wage a different kind of war. He unleashed propaganda, calling Cleopatra a seductress, a foreign corrupter, a queen who enchanted Roman men and turned them against their own country. The Senate murmured, the people whispered. The myth of Cleopatra, the dangerous Eastern temptress, began to take shape, burying the real woman beneath layers of fear and fantasy. Antony defended her fiercely, but Rome grew restless. Cleopatra sensed that the true enemy was no longer armies, nor rival siblings, nor even the shifting politics of Egypt. The true enemy was perception, the power of a story, repeated enough times to become truth. Still, she stood beside Antony. She gave him ships, gold, soldiers. She bore him children. She believed that together they could carve a new future, one where Egypt and Rome stood as partners, not adversaries. But Octavian was patient. And while Cleopatra and Antony lived in the radiance of Alexandria, Rome's future emperor sharpened his strategies. He gathered allies, stretched his influence, and positioned himself as the defender of Roman tradition against a foreign threat. The clash was inevitable. Antony and Cleopatra prepared for war, knowing Octavian would never rest until he destroyed them. Ships were built, troops were trained, spies raced across the Mediterranean, and somewhere deep inside, Cleopatra felt the same chill she had felt the day she learned of Caesar's death. History was shifting again, and once more, she would have to fight for her throne, her children, her legacy, and for the love of a man who was slowly being consumed by Rome's unforgiving storm. War crept across the Mediterranean like a tightening noose. Cleopatra could feel it in the letters arriving from Roman spies, in the shifting winds of Alexandria's harbor, in the heaviness of Antony's footsteps as he paced the palace halls. Octavian was no longer merely a political rival. He was an architect of destiny. He had shaped a narrative so powerful that half the world already believed it, that Antony was bewitched, that Cleopatra sought to claim Rome through seduction, that their alliance was a threat to civilization itself. Cleopatra understood propaganda better than most. She knew that perception could be more deadly than any sword, but even she underestimated how far Octavian would go. He rallied Rome behind him, declaring war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra personally, transforming a political struggle into a crusade against a queen he painted as monstrous. With public opinion now weaponized, he prepared his armies, while Antony and Cleopatra gathered what remained of their strength. Their fate would be decided at sea. The Battle of Actium unfolded beneath a burning sun. Cleopatra stood on the deck of her flagship, the queen's crown glinting in the harsh light, her heart pounding like a war drum. Antony commanded his fleet nearby, but his confidence had eroded. Too many generals had defected to Octavian. Too many ships were undermanned. And as the battle began, the sea churned with chaos. Splintered wood, shouted orders, waves stained with wreckage. Cleopatra's fleet fought fiercely, but they were outmaneuvered. Smoke curled upward. Roman ships rammed into Egyptian hulls. Flaming arrows sliced through the sky. In the middle of the chaos, Cleopatra saw the inevitable. The battle was lost. Staying meant annihilation, so she made a desperate choice. She turned her fleet away, retreating to save what forces she could. Some say Antony saw her sails and fled after her in a moment of weakness. Others claim he had already lost control of the battle. History never agrees. But one truth remains. That day, the tides of power shifted forever. They returned to Alexandria hollowed, their forces shattered, their kingdom cornered. Antony, once Rome's greatest general, now wandered the palace like a fallen god, haunted by guilt, unable to see a future beyond the smoke of Actium. Cleopatra loved him still, but she knew that love no longer had the power to save them. Octavian advanced quickly, marching across Egypt with disciplined precision. Cities surrendered without resistance. Allies vanished. The sand itself seemed to bow to Rome's new master. Cleopatra retreated into her most secure chambers, consulting scholars, strategists, and priests. She explored every possibility: surrender, negotiation, escape. But all paths led to the same grim conclusion. Octavian did not want cooperation. He wanted her humiliation. He wanted Cleopatra paraded through Rome in chains, displayed as the villain of his political tale, a foreign queen who corrupted noble Roman blood. For a woman who had once been worshipped as a goddess, that fate was worse than death. When Antony received false news that Cleopatra had taken her own life, something inside him broke entirely. He fell on his sword, but the wound did not kill him immediately. Bleeding, trembling, desperate to reach her, he was carried to her hidden chamber. Cleopatra held him in her arms as he died, one last tragedy in a life defined by both passion and war. She kissed him with the tenderness of a woman who had lost not just a lover, but the last person who truly understood her. After his death, Cleopatra made her final decision. She would not be paraded. She would not bow. She would choose her own ending. Octavian attempted to negotiate. He promised mercy. He promised safety for her children. But Cleopatra knew lies when she heard them. She had seen too much, fought too much, lost too much to be deceived at the end. She returned to her mausoleum, her final sanctuary, where she had gathered treasures, scrolls, and symbols of her reign. She dressed herself in royal garments, arranged her hair like the goddess Isis, and sat upon a golden couch as if awaiting coronation. And there, with unwavering calm, she allowed the asp to bite her. The poison moved quickly, a quiet descent into sleep. She felt the world blur around her, the columns, the gold, the scent of incense. She thought of her children, of Alexandria's harbor, of the Nile glistening at sunrise. She thought of the moments where she had been powerful, fearless, alive. She thought of Caesar. She thought of Antony. She thought of destiny. And then she was gone. When Octavian's men found her, Cleopatra lay serene, almost radiant, as if death had merely shifted her into another realm. Octavian would become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, and Cleopatra would be remembered not as the monster he described, but as the last sovereign of Egypt's ancient glory, a woman who refused to be conquered, a queen who shaped the fate of empires. History would twist her story 1,000 times, turning her into legend, myth, seductress, strategist, goddess, villain, icon. But beneath the layers of propaganda and fantasy, one truth endures. Cleopatra did not live quietly, and she did not die defeated. She lived as a queen. She died as a queen. And across thousands of years, her name still echoes like the whisper of a desert wind, unbroken, unforgettable, eternal.